The vast majority of individuals navigate their existence by attempting to evade the weight of their internal states, seeking to dampen their intensity or distract themselves with a forced sense of optimism. However, a profound irony exists within this struggle, as the more one battles their inner sensations, the more they find themselves enslaved by those very forces. Rage tends to erupt at the most inopportune instances, while dread paralyzes us precisely when action is required, and a constant sense of unease erodes our ability to concentrate or rest. Grief often matures into a silent lack of confidence, yet the fundamental reality that eludes most is that these difficult states are not your adversaries. Rather, they represent an untapped reservoir of vitality. Every intense feeling possesses a specific frequency of raw vigor, and when this vigor lacks a guiding hand, it inevitably dissolves into internal turbulence. Conversely, when that same intensity is refined and focused through deliberate practice, it undergoes a transformation into a formidable sense of personal authority. This experience is not designed to help you diminish your feelings, but rather to teach you how to govern them effectively. The core issue has never been an excess of sensitivity. Instead, it lies in the fact that no one provided you with a blueprint for managing these waves as they surface. Traditional advice often suggests hiding your feelings, looking away, or simply feigning a sense of well-being, yet these tactics do not build resilience. In truth, they merely postpone an inevitable breakdown, whereas genuine fortitude is found in the quiet capacity to remain anchored while the internal tides rise. It is the conscious choice of action over reaction, maintaining a sharp mind even as external demands increase, which defines an indomitable spirit. Throughout the following hour, you will discover how to reshape the feelings that most avoid into instruments of excellence that few ever master. You will understand that fury is not inherently ruinous but can serve as the bedrock of your personal limits and self-worth when handled with precision. Furthermore, you will see that apprehension is not a sign of fragility but a vital indicator for tactical planning, whereas the scattered energy of worry can be redirected into immediate motion. Even sorrow, when faced directly, offers a profound depth of insight rather than a heavy burden of despair, and ultimately, you will master the art of preventing your internal states from dictating your life choices. This journey is neither a clinical session nor a temporary spark of inspiration, nor is it a plea for constant cheerfulness. It is a rigorous process of emotional education. Consider the human psyche as a high-performance machine, where your internal drives serve as the high-octane propellant. Lacking a steady hand, that machine will eventually succumb to friction and collapse, yet with proper guidance, it becomes an unstoppable force for progress. The objective here is never to become a hollow vessel, as a lack of feeling is merely a facade for a lack of strength. The true aim is the mastery of your own internal landscape. This mastery ensures that while you still encounter frustration, it serves to sharpen your focus rather than causing a total breakdown, and while you still feel the sting of pain, it serves to fortify your character instead of shattering it. True authority is never boisterous, as it does not crave the spotlight or demand external validation to exist. It is clearly visible in the individual who maintains their composure while the surrounding world descends into panic, and it is felt in those who do not desperately seek the approval of others or instant relief from their discomfort. This level of self-governance is an acquired skill that is accessible to anyone willing to engage in the necessary work. Within this recording, every section will address a specific internal force and offer a concrete strategy for its transmutation, moving past abstract theories to provide principles you can implement immediately. You are not required to reinvent your personality or mend a broken self, nor must you eradicate your feelings to find peace. You must simply learn to lead them. For the moment you transition from reflexive behavior to a state of observation and conscious choice, you cease to be a pawn of circumstance. Real agency begins in that space between a stimulus and your chosen response. So as we move forward, find your center and accept this fundamental premise. You do not require a more tranquil internal world, but a far more robust command over it. In this first chapter, we examine why the majority of people surrender their autonomy to their internal shifts, often harboring the belief that their feelings are external events that simply occur. They view anger as a sudden intruder or anxiety as an uninvited guest that arrives without warning, and having accepted this premise, they feel incapable of influencing the aftermath. This perspective is the foundational error in human self-development, for the truth is that your power is not stolen, it is surrendered incrementally through instinctive, unthinking reactions. Since childhood, most are taught the art of avoidance rather than the science of leadership, as common phrases like, settle down, or don't be upset, create a damaging psychological pattern. These suggestions imply that emotions are errors to be corrected rather than vital data to be decoded and energy to be utilized for a purpose. When we categorize our internal world as a hostile territory, we inevitably fall into the trap of either explosive outbursts or silent repression. The former manifests as heated arguments and impulsive choices that lead to deep regret, while the latter appears controlled but creates an internal pressure that eventually manifests as chronic tension or self-undoing. Both of these paths result in the same forfeiture of self-rule, hence we find that true empowerment starts with a radical change in perception. You must realize that your internal states are not orders you must obey, but signals that demand your attention and direction. Your internal states function as dispatches, not as mandates. The precise second you mistake a visceral sensation for a direct command, you relinquish your role as the architect of your own life. While frustration may indicate that a boundary has been crossed, it does not necessitate an act of aggression. Similarly, while apprehension may highlight a potential hazard, it does not demand a frantic retreat. The sense of unease that accompanies uncertainty is merely a pointer, not a requirement for stagnation. The actual drain on one's personal power stems not from the intensity of the sensation itself, but from the reflexive velocity of the response. Most individuals find themselves reacting before they have taken a single breath or made a conscious evaluation, essentially bypassing the narrow corridor between a feeling and a deed where true agency resides. For many, this corridor is non-existent, operating much like the instinctive withdrawal of a hand from a scorching surface. This occurs because the human nervous system often categorizes emotional surges as immediate threats to survival, triggering a physical readiness for action long before the analytical mind can weigh in. However, unlike a physical burn, these psychological triggers are seldom matters of life and death, even though they possess a deceptive sense of urgency. Each time you allow an instant reaction to take the lead, you are effectively instructing your nervous system that your impulses are the true masters, fostering a state of emotional reliance. This leads to a desperate pursuit of external validation, temporary distractions, or any form of comfort to drown out the internal noise, which only serves to erode your psychological endurance over time. Consequently, this explains why individuals often utter words they later mourn or make choices that lead to long-term regret. They are operating under a perceived external force that doesn't actually exist. Furthermore, a significant loss of autonomy occurs due to the widespread misidentification of what truly constitutes strength. In modern discourse, there is a tendency to celebrate raw emotional expression while neglecting the more difficult path of internal governance. Being boisterous is frequently conflated with being genuine, and acting on impulse is often mistaken for authenticity, just as the mere venting of frustrations is confused with actual restoration. In reality, expression that lacks a guiding hand is not a sign of vigor but rather a sign of internal leakage. Authentic power is instead measured by the capacity for restraint, the words you decide to withhold, and the impulses you choose to examine before they manifest. The most formidable characters are not those who have become hollow or unfeeling, they are those who possess profound discipline, experiencing the full spectrum of human feeling while remaining the sole judges of what merits a tangible response. This loss of control is also deeply tied to the concept of identity fusion, where a person begins to see their temporary states as permanent traits. By framing one's existence around statements such as, "I am a nervous person," or "I am an angry individual," a destructive psychological merger occurs that obscures perspective. This linguistic habit suggests that the emotion is an unchangeable part of your core being, whereas power is actually regained the moment you establish a healthy distance. You are not the storm itself. You are the observer standing on the shore, and this distinction is what reinstates your ability to choose, which serves as the very bedrock of self-regulation. Finally, we must recognize that personal authority is often eroded not through grand failures, but through the accumulation of minor, neglected reactions. It is the quiet leak of passive-aggressive remarks, the habit of emotional withdrawal, or the cycle of nocturnal rumination that gradually dismantles your inner fortress. Every minor impulse you surrender to reinforces a template that eventually defines your character and dictates your future trajectory. Therefore, the pursuit of mastery is not defined by a single, heroic act of will, but by the consistent, daily practice of slowing down the internal machinery. The objective is to perceive the rising tide, create a deliberate pause, identify the force at play, and only then select the most effective path forward. That brief interval, though it may only last for a few seconds, represents the boundary between lasting regret and unshakable poise. It is the point where emotional vigor stops being a master and starts being a servant. Throughout this journey, you will explore techniques to widen that critical gap, conditioning your nervous system to remain steady so that you may act from a place of values rather than mere instinct. Ultimately, the reality is as simple as it is challenging. Whichever force governs your reactions governs your life, and reclaiming that steering wheel is the only way to truly possess your power. Hence we find ourselves at the second chapter, which focuses on the nature of fury, perhaps the most misinterpreted energetic force in our current era. Society often demands that we fear, hide, or apologize for our rage, labeling it as something inherently primitive or ruinous. Because of this cultural conditioning, many either succumb to explosive outbursts or bury their fire so deeply that it consumes them from within, both of which are paths to weakness. However, when viewed through a more analytical lens, this force is not synonymous with violence. It is a specialized form of vitality dedicated to the preservation of boundaries. It surfaces specifically when your core principles are disregarded, your time is exploited, or your dignity is undermined. In this context, the heat of frustration is not a character flaw to be fixed, but a sophisticated alarm system indicating that something of profound value requires your protection. The complications arise primarily when this inner fire remains unrefined, as an undisciplined state of fury seeks nothing but instant discharge. It yearns to strike out, to overwhelm, or to validate its own pain through punishment. This state of mind significantly constricts your cognitive range and accelerates your physical reflexes, leading to language that is far more caustic than intended and actions that are purely instinctive. Once the intensity of the moment subsides, it is almost inevitably followed by a heavy sense of remorse. Consequently, this is why such an emotion carries a negative legacy. People tend to link it with destruction, the dismantling of professional reputations, the fracturing of personal bonds, and the erosion of one's own dignity. However, that wreckage is not a byproduct of the feeling itself, but rather a direct result of surrendering the steering wheel. On the other end of the spectrum, the act of stifling this energy is equally detrimental. When frustration is forced down instead of being articulated with precision, it does not simply vanish, it migrates inward, fermenting into bitterness, silent resentment, or a persistent state of irritation. Over a long period, this internalized pressure dissolves your self-assurance and eats away at your self-regard. While an outburst dissipates your energy, suppression effectively poisons your internal environment. Hence we find that the superior path is either of these, but rather the path of deliberate channeling. When you bring this internal force under your command, it transforms into one of the most potent assets at your disposal, sharpening your mental focus and bringing your personal limits into high relief. It provides the necessary grit to decline unreasonable requests, to communicate with transparent honesty, and to execute decisions with a firm hand without becoming submerged in the feeling. The vital transition lies in understanding that this sensation is not designed to dictate your behavior, but to provide critical information. It poses a fundamental inquiry. Which of my principles is currently being neglected? When you decelerate enough to actually address that question, the emotion transitions from a state of turbulence into a functional tool. Instead of merely reacting, you are converting raw vigor into purposeful intent. This is precisely where the majority of individuals falter. They treat their frustration as a final judgment rather than a notification. They operate under the false assumption that because they feel the heat of irritation, they must take immediate action. Yet, this sense of urgency is a psychological mirage. Authentic authority is actually characterized by stillness. Consider the profound difference between a heated argument and the calm articulation of a limit. While yelling might offer a fleeting illusion of dominance, it generally undermines your standing, whereas clear and composed declarations carry an undeniable weight. Others tend to respect you more when you remain poised, as they recognize that you are not seeking to oppress them, but are simply defining the parameters of your space. This is the essence of internal leadership. To refine this energy, your initial step must be to physically slow the internal process. As irritation mounts, the body enters a state of acceleration, the pulse quickens, respiration becomes shallow, and physical tension builds. This is the peak moment where most instinctive, and often regrettable, reactions occur. Instead of following that impulse, you must create a deliberate pause, breathing with intentionality to regain your footing. Identify the sensation with precise language, stating, "I am noticing a sense of frustration," rather than identifying your entire self with the feeling. This linguistic shift is crucial because it generates a mental clearing between your core identity and the temporary state, allowing control to return. From this vantage point, you can analyze which boundary has been breached, whether it pertains to your time, your reputation, your principles, or your expectations. Once that breach is identified, the appropriate response becomes both obvious and measured. A governed response might involve phrases such as, "I cannot agree to those terms, this behavior is not acceptable to me," or, "I have a different expectation for this situation." These statements are resilient and direct. They carry gravity without being laden with insults or volatile energy, effectively turning your internal heat into a shield of self-respect. Furthermore, this discipline fundamentally alters how the world interacts with you over time. When you stop fluctuating between explosive outbursts and silent withdrawal, others naturally cease their attempts to test your limits. Your boundaries become palpable and respect increases, not because you have demanded it through force, but because you have modeled self-mastery. There is also a profound internal benefit to this practice. It reinforces the bond you have with yourself. Every time you bypass an impulse in favor of a chosen response, you solidify the evidence that you are the one in charge. This consistent reliability evolves into a deep-seated confidence, not a loud or arrogant sort, but a grounded certainty in your own resilience. When mastered, this force becomes a catalyst for personal evolution, pushing you to rectify draining situations and sharpening your sense of priority. It serves as a constant reminder that your internal landscape has immense value and is worthy of protection. The most formidable individuals are not those devoid of heat, but those who never allow that heat to dictate their direction. As we move forward through this exploration, you will learn to apply these same principles to dread, unease, and sorrow, all of which contain their own hidden potential. However, always remember this foundational truth: your internal fire is not a defect to be extinguished, but a boundary to be honored, and leading that fire is where your greatest strength resides. Within the third chapter, we explore the concept of apprehension, a state often mistakenly viewed as the antithesis of bravery. There exists a pervasive social assumption that the presence of dread implies a lack of fortitude, readiness, or capability, and this internalized narrative frequently dictates how individuals evaluate their own worth. People tend to mask their trepidation, suppress it, or allow it to secretly steer their life choices while maintaining a facade of composure. However, the biological intent of dread was never to act as a barrier to progress. Its true function is to facilitate preparation. It is, in fact, one of the most sophisticated cognitive processes available to us, scanning for potential hazards and unfamiliar variables long before the logical mind can articulate a response. When utilized with precision, it functions as a strategic alert system that maintains a high state of awareness, yet when it is misinterpreted, it manifests as total stagnation. The fundamental error lies in the conflation of a feeling of unease with the presence of actual danger, for a sense of dread does not guarantee a negative outcome, it merely highlights a possibility. This subtle distinction is transformative, as most individuals respond to this internal alarm by either completely withdrawing from the challenge or racing through it to end the discomfort. Both of these reactions are self-defeating, as avoidance restricts the scope of your life, while haste leads to compromised decision-making. Dread only turns ruinous when it is either ignored entirely or followed without question, whereas regaining autonomy requires viewing the feeling as a dispatch rather than a mandate. The primary inquiry posed by this internal state is quite pragmatic. Do you possess the necessary readiness for this task? If the honest answer is negative, then the emotion is simply fulfilling its role by pointing out a deficit in your expertise, your planning, or your overall preparedness. The issue is rarely the presence of the feeling itself, but rather the existence of that objective gap. Most people attempt to eradicate the sensation of unease without actually addressing the underlying lack of readiness, seeking out temporary validation or a false sense of bravado that inevitably crumbles under genuine pressure. Conversely, systematic preparation serves to naturally soothe the mind. There is a profound difference between entering a situation as a novice versus entering as a trained professional. In the latter case, the intensity of the feeling remains, but it is effectively channeled into a sharp, focused state of engagement rather than a paralyzing panic. This is why true courage is built upon the foundation of competence. Dread does not vanish through the repetition of optimistic phrases, but through the mind's developing trust in your actual capacity to navigate the environment. To refine your response to this force, you must decelerate the mental process and convert the energy into tangible action. When dread surfaces, the imagination tends to leap forward into catastrophic future scenarios that are often devoid of evidence. Hence, we find that the best remedy is to ground the emotion in the immediate present. You must ask yourself what specifically triggers the unease, which elements of the situation are within your sphere of influence, and what concrete steps can be taken in this very moment. These questions strip the feeling of its abstract power and turn it into a blueprint for strategy. Preparation is not synonymous with overthinking. It involves identifying specific skills to sharpen, data to collect, or decisions to finalize. When the energy of dread is redirected into these tasks, the internal spiral ceases. This is the reason why disciplined individuals appear unshakable, not because they are devoid of feeling, but because they have conditioned themselves to translate that feeling into a superior response. Furthermore, this internal state provides a valuable lesson in humility, reminding us that personal evolution always takes place at the very edge of our comfort zone. If one waits for a total absence of unease before acting, they will remain in a state of permanent delay, as every significant advancement involves a degree of the unknown. The objective is not to achieve a state of fearlessness, but to develop a functional relationship with your dread, one that encourages caution and attentiveness without halting your momentum. It allows you to respect the inherent risks of a situation without surrendering your agency to them. Another hurdle to mastery is the habit of identity attachment, where people interpret their nervousness as a definitive verdict on their potential. This is a false conclusion. Dread does not measure what you are capable of achieving, but rather how close you are to your next stage of growth. The mind naturally resists the unfamiliar in favor of the known, even when the known is stifling, yet facing these feelings with deliberate preparation shifts your internal self-image from one of fragility to one of adaptability. This shift fosters a profound self-reliance that reduces internal friction far more effectively than any external reassurance. Over time, this training builds a deep resilience, teaching you that discomfort is not synonymous with danger, and that strategic preparation will always overcome blind panic. Ultimately, this internal force ceases to be a wall and becomes a gateway. It is not an adversary to be defeated, but a guide to be consulted before moving forward with purpose. By asking what the emotion is requiring you to prepare for, you transform an apparent obstacle into a powerful ally. Within the 4th chapter, we analyze the phenomenon of unease, which is not merely an escalation of dread, but rather dread amplified by the dimension of time. While a basic fear responds to a localized and specific hazard, unease disperses that sense of threat across an infinite array of imagined futures, taking hypothetical scenarios and weaving them into a persistent mental weight. Consequently, the physical frame remains in a state of high tension and the psyche stays on high alert, making true recovery nearly impossible even when the immediate surroundings are perfectly safe. This explains the profound exhaustion associated with this state. You are effectively engaging in combat with phantoms and conflicts that have not yet materialized. A common misconception is the belief that one can think their way out of this condition, leading individuals to obsessively analyze, predict, and rehearse potential outcomes. However, unease is not resolved through increased mental activity. It is actually fueled by excessive and unmanaged rumination. It arises the moment the intellect abandons the current moment, creating a rift between the body, which exists only in the present, and a mind that is lost in a cycle of what-if scenarios. These internal inquiries possess a deceptive sense of urgency, yet they rarely produce actionable intelligence, instead draining your vital energy without ever reaching a state of clarity. Hence we find that the initial phase of mastery involves recognizing that unease is essentially a case of misplaced attention. Your focus has drifted into a distant horizon without a structured path back to the present, and in that vacuum of direction, the mind instinctively populates the void with perceived dangers. To reclaim your autonomy, your attention must be anchored, yet many fail by attempting to achieve this through purely mental arguments. The intellect is rarely soothed by logic alone. It requires the grounding force of physical action. Even the most minor, deliberate movement serves as a signal to the nervous system that you are still the director of your actions, and unease begins to dissipate the moment the body starts moving with clear intent. Therefore, the most effective strategy is to pivot away from asking how to stop the feeling and instead identify the single most controllable task directly in front of you. While unease flourishes in the abstract and the vague, power thrives in the specific and the clear. When the mind attempts to leap 10 steps ahead to a final outcome, the sheer distance creates a crushing sense of pressure. You must collapse that distance by focusing exclusively on the immediate step, one message, one choice, or one singular task. Furthermore, internal resistance plays a significant role in intensifying this emotional weight. Many individuals compound their discomfort by judging themselves for feeling it, creating an internal friction that only serves to heighten the sensation. Adopting a stance of neutral acknowledgement, simply noticing the presence of the feeling without the burden of should, removes this unnecessary layer of conflict. Acceptance in this context is not a form of giving up. It is a tactical recognition of reality that allows you to stop feeding the fire with the currency of your attention. You do not need to eradicate every stray thought. You simply need to stop chasing them, redirecting your focus back to the tangible reality of your posture, your breathing, or your current environment. This shift informs your nervous system that you are secure enough to remain in the now. Finally, we must acknowledge that this state is as much a physiological event as it is a mental one, representing trapped energy that requires a physical outlet. Simple, intentional movements like walking or controlled stretching can restore a natural rhythm to the body and signal a state of safety. Over time, this practice builds a deep sense of self-trust, as you realize that while the mind may occasionally run ahead, you are not obligated to follow it into the weeds. You learn to recognize the early signs of a spiral and redirect your focus before it gains momentum. The most centered individuals are not those who are immune to unease, but those who have mastered the art of returning their attention to what they can govern in the present moment. By shrinking your horizon to the immediate now, you strip this force of its ability to dominate your internal world, eventually causing it to lose its grip on your life entirely. Within the 5th chapter, we examine the nature of sorrow, the specific internal state that most individuals are most desperate to evade. It possesses a unique ability to decelerate our energy, dampen our motivation, and cast a persistent heaviness that modern society encourages us to avoid at any price. In a world that prizes velocity, relentless optimism, and constant advancement, sorrow appears to move in a contrary direction, leading many to mislabel it as a functional error. However, this state is not a defect within your psychological architecture. It is a vital indicator that something of profound significance is being processed. While frustration marks a breach of limits, and dread highlights potential hazards, sorrow surfaces in the wake of loss, transition, or unfulfilled expectations. It emerges the moment the intellect acknowledges that a meaningful aspect of life has changed. This realization necessitates a certain psychological depth, and we must understand that depth is never synonymous with fragility. The true hazard of sorrow does not reside in the sensation itself, but in the consequences of rushing, stifling, or misinterpreting it. The prevailing cultural narrative often urges us to look on the bright side, or find immediate distractions, leading many to bury their feelings under a mountain of work, digital noise, or emotional numbness. While these tactics might provide a fleeting reprieve, they prevent the essential integration of the experience. An unfinished emotion does not simply vanish, it returns in more corrosive manifestations, such as a sense of apathy, internal emptiness, or a quiet, lingering despair. Sorrow that is evaded eventually transforms into a permanent weight, whereas sorrow that is faced directly matures into a profound clarity. A pervasive and damaging myth suggests that if you acknowledge your grief, it will entirely consume you, yet the reality is that the intensity only deepens through resistance. When the battle against the feeling ceases, the emotion begins to soften, moving through your system rather than becoming a permanent blockage. Furthermore, sorrow requires a state of stillness rather than a frantic search for solutions. Unlike the high-energy demands of rage or apprehension, this state requires nothing more than your presence. It asks you to decelerate sufficiently to experience what must be felt, a task that is often uncomfortable in a culture defined by productivity, yet it remains indispensable for psychological integrity. When honored, this state provides invaluable data, illuminating what you truly treasure and clarifying what must be released or redefined. This is precisely why such moments often precede great insight. As distractions fall away, the mind becomes more transparent, allowing you to recognize patterns and truths you had previously ignored. However, a sharp distinction must be drawn between healthy sorrow and the spiral of self-pity. While genuine sorrow is quiet and reflective, self-pity is loud, repetitive, and seeks to build a permanent identity around the loss. When the feeling is transformed into a narrative of personal failure, believing that one is uniquely broken or destined for misfortune, it ceases to be a productive process and becomes a trap of helplessness. To navigate this terrain effectively, you must remain anchored in observation rather than total identification. Acknowledging that you are experiencing a wave of sadness is a grounded, objective stance, whereas deciding that you are a sad person merges your core identity with a temporary state. This fusion is what causes the emotion to linger indefinitely, fed by a constant cycle of interpretation rather than natural processing. Healthy sorrow has a rhythmic quality, rising and receding like the tide. Your task is to allow the wave to pass without allowing it to pull you under. Engaging in reflective practices such as writing or meaningful dialogue helps to organize this raw feeling into a coherent understanding, making the pain intelligible even if it does not immediately erase it. Ultimately, this force serves to reset your internal priorities. When an era of your life concludes, sorrow clears the psychological space, stripping away what is no longer relevant. Many fear the resulting emptiness, yet this void is not a lack of substance, it is the birthplace of new possibility. This depth fosters discernment, which in turn cultivates wisdom. Individuals who habitually bypass their sorrow often lack a certain emotional range and struggle to form deep connections, as they are unwilling to face their own vulnerability. In contrast, those who have sat with their grief develop a profound sense of empathy and patience, understanding that true strength is not the performance of constant cheerfulness, but the capacity to remain present through discomfort without losing one's internal compass. As we continue, remember that sorrow is not an invitation to flee from your inner world, but a call to understand it more intimately. When met with respect and presence, it reveals your true character and serves as a quiet force that reinforces your foundational strength. Within the 6th chapter, we examine the intricate nature of shame and guilt, two forces often discussed as a single entity, yet they function in entirely different ways. Conflating these two leads to immense, unnecessary suffering and a cycle of perpetual self-reproach. While one serves as a potential compass for personal growth, the other acts as a silent architect of your own destruction. The fundamental distinction lies in the target. Guilt suggests that your behavior was flawed, whereas shame insists that you are inherently defective. This divergence is more critical than most realize. Guilt, in its functional form, highlights a disconnect between your choices and your core principles, inviting you to take responsibility and adjust your path. Once the correction is made, guilt has fulfilled its purpose and should naturally dissipate. Shame, however, is a relentless weight that attacks your very identity. It does not seek improvement but demands punishment, convincing you that you are fundamentally unworthy or permanently broken. Under the shadow of shame, evolution feels hazardous because vulnerability feels like an invitation to further humiliation. Hence, we find that shame is a profoundly paralyzing force. Those ensnared by it often avoid self-reflection because it feels like a personal assault, and they may shy away from accountability not out of a lack of care, but because the weight of caring is simply too heavy to bear. Shame is masterful at disguise, often masquerading as brutal honesty or self-awareness, while it quietly erodes your confidence from within. It does not make you a superior person, it simply makes you a smaller version of yourself. This persistence is often rooted in early experiences of criticism or rejection that have become internalized over time. Eventually, you no longer require an external judge because you have built a courtroom within your own mind where the verdict is perpetually unfavorable. Reclaiming your power requires a radical separation of your deeds from your worth. You must develop the capacity to acknowledge an error without attacking your essence. By shifting the internal inquiry from, "What is wrong with me?" to, "What requires correction?" you transform a stagnant state into one of empowered responsibility. Furthermore, a significant hurdle to mastery is the mistaken belief that self-punishment is a form of accountability. Many fear that if they stop berating themselves, they are somehow shirking their duties, yet self-attack only breeds dread, and dread is a poor fuel for sustainable growth. Genuine accountability is characterized by a calm, observant mindset that corrects and moves forward without the need for internal theater. Guilt should function as a temporary warning light rather than a life sentence. If it persists, it usually indicates that either a repair remains unfinished or it has metastasized into shame. The remedy is always purposeful action: rectify what is possible, offer an apology where needed, and change your behavior. Beyond that, the feeling serves no constructive purpose and must be released. To dissolve the grip of shame, you must challenge the false premise that your value as a human is conditional or earned through a performance of perfection. Authentic inner authority is not built on flawlessness, but on integrity, the consistent alignment of your actions with your values over time. Strong individuals do not view themselves as above mistakes. They simply view themselves as capable of learning from them without experiencing a total psychological collapse. This process requires a grounded form of compassion, one that refuses to excuse harm but also refuses to turn a mistake into a permanent identity. Treating yourself with respect during the process of correction reinforces a sense of self-trust, which is the cornerstone of emotional mastery. As we move forward, become vigilant regarding the language of your inner critic. When a voice demands punishment rather than improvement, recognize it as shame and question its utility. The moment you refuse to let shame define your narrative, you reclaim authority over your internal world. Let guilt guide your evolution briefly, but never allow shame to act as your teacher. Within the 7th chapter, we explore the concept of emotional detachment, a state frequently misconstrued as coldness, indifference, or a lack of empathy. Many resist this practice, fearing that by letting go of their immediate reactions, they might lose their humanity or become psychologically shut down. However, authentic detachment has nothing to do with becoming a hollow vessel. Rather, it is the ultimate expression of personal liberty. It is the refined capacity to experience the full spectrum of human feeling without being governed by it. Detachment represents the critical clearing between an external stimulus and your internal response, allowing you to observe what surfaces within your mind without the compulsion to act or the mistake of identification. This is the definition of authority without cruelty and governance without stifling repression. Most individuals are tethered to their internal states in ways they rarely acknowledge. They operate under the false assumption that every feeling requires immediate expression to be considered authentic. Yet this habitual reactivity often obscures the truth and weakens one's standing. Detachment restores the power of choice. Without it, your internal state is perpetually at the mercy of external variables. A casual remark can dismantle your mood, a specific look can ignite fury, and silence can breed a crippling sense of unease. In such a state, you have effectively outsourced the keys to your inner world to circumstances beyond your command. Detachment severs this dependency. It does not imply that you cease to value your relationships or goals. It simply means you refuse to let them dictate your internal equilibrium. This is precisely why those who master this skill appear unshakable under duress. They do not absorb the emotional turbulence of their environment. They observe the data, weigh the options, and then decide on a course of action. That brief pause is not a sign of hesitation, it is a demonstration of absolute self-governance. A vital distinction must be made between detachment and avoidance. While avoidance is a flight from emotion that leaves the issue unresolved and the individual weakened, detachment is the act of remaining centered while the emotion completes its natural cycle. To cultivate this, one must first become vigilant regarding how often feelings attempt to mandate behavior. An impulse of irritation may urge a biting retort, or a flash of insecurity might drive a desperate search for validation. While these internal surges are not wrong, they do not merit automatic obedience. Mastery begins with silent observation. By labeling a sensation as something you are noticing rather than something you are, you create the psychological distance necessary for control to return. Furthermore, this practice involves a physical component. Emotions manifest in the body as tension, shallow breathing, or restlessness. By deliberately relaxing the physical frame, you signal to your nervous system that you are secure, causing the emotional momentum to dissipate. This discipline often feels unnatural initially, as the psyche is accustomed to the immediate release of reaction. When you interrupt this established cycle, the emotion may briefly intensify as it seeks its habitual outlet. You must remain steady during this peak, realizing that you are not suppressing the feeling, but simply waiting for the fog of intensity to lift so that clarity can emerge. Ultimately, detachment reintroduces a sense of proportion to our lives. Emotions have a tendency to exaggerate the present, making temporary setbacks feel like permanent catastrophes. Detachment provides the perspective needed to realize that these states are transient, not absolute truths. This skill significantly enhances your decision-making and leadership, as you become capable of acting in alignment with your long-term objectives rather than seeking short-term emotional relief. Paradoxically, this stability deepens your connections with others, as it removes the volatility that often sabotages interactions. Each act of restraint serves as tangible proof of your own fortitude, quietly building a foundation of self-trust. You do not need to feel less to be formidable. You simply need to choose your actions with greater intentionality. When you cease allowing your feelings to rush your decisions, you stop being a pawn of circumstance and begin to lead with unshakable inner power. Within the 8th chapter, we explore the concept of emotional endurance, a trait frequently conflated with mere intensity. While society often admires those who exhibit profound sensitivity or bold reactions, such intensity is fleeting. Authentic endurance is what persists once the initial surge of feeling has subsided. It is the capacity to remain present within discomfort without a desperate need for immediate alleviation. This involves the ability to withstand pressure, ambiguity, frustration, or even profound boredom while maintaining internal stability. Because this skill is exceedingly rare, it generates a potent and understated form of authority. Most individuals do not suffer from a surplus of feeling, but from an inability to tolerate the sensations they experience. Consequently, discomfort becomes a trigger for escape, leading many to utilize digital distractions, food, or constant activity to numb their unease. Each instance of flight effectively trains the nervous system to descend into panic at the first sign of internal friction. Endurance is cultivated by adopting the opposite approach, allowing small measures of discomfort to exist without seeking a quick exit. This is not a call for self-overwhelming, but for the gradual expansion of your psychological tolerance. Much like physical fibers strengthening under managed resistance, your emotional capacity matures under deliberate pressure. When unease surfaces, your primary objective is simply to stay, not to analyze or provide a critique, but to remain anchored in the present. By observing the physical texture of the sensation, you will notice that it is rarely static. It rises and recedes naturally when it is not met with resistance. In truth, resistance acts as an amplifier, whereas presence serves to dissolve the intensity. Emotions possess a natural lifespan and will eventually burn themselves out if the cycle is permitted to conclude, yet most people interrupt this process through distraction, causing the emotion to remain unresolved and chronic. Furthermore, A significant drain on endurance is the habit of catastrophizing. The intellect often misinterprets a spike in discomfort as a sign of imminent danger, generating narratives of being unable to handle the situation. These thoughts are typically reflections of a low tolerance threshold rather than a lack of actual capacity. Endurance flourishes when you gently challenge these assumptions, reminding yourself that the sensation is both temporary and harmless. This cognitive reframing shifts the nervous system out of a defensive threat mode, reducing the compulsion to flee and fostering a sense of resilience. This skill is particularly vital for achieving long-term objectives that require patience, such as mastery, trust, and stability. Those with high endurance are not rigid, they are flexible, possessing the ability to experience significant stress without fracturing or collapsing into poor choices. In social dynamics, this capacity provides immense leverage, allowing you to listen without defensiveness and remain composed while others escalate. In solitude, it permits you to coexist with your own thoughts without the crutch of stimulation. Ultimately, endurance redefines your relationship with dread and unease. Once you realize you can survive discomfort, these forces lose their urgency and their grip. You can also voluntarily train this baseline by choosing situations that require restraint, such as waiting in silence or completing tasks without interruption. These practices recalibrate the nervous system, demonstrating that boredom and unease are survivable and often productive. Over time, this steadiness becomes your new foundation, allowing internal storms to pass without uprooting your sense of self. It fosters a quiet dignity and self-containment, as you no longer seek rescue or demand emotional relief from others. As we proceed, recognize that endurance is not about becoming harder or more callous, but about becoming steadier. This steadiness grants you clarity, and clarity enables the choices that constitute true power. When you can remain with discomfort without fleeing, you unlock a depth of strength that is independent of external moods or approval. Within the 9th chapter, we explore the concept of emotional discipline, which is fundamentally distinct from the attempt to regulate your internal sensations. It is, instead, the art of governing your conduct in response to those sensations. While many perceive discipline as a form of rigid restriction or forced suppression, its true nature is far more subtle and significantly more impactful. It is the refined capacity to pause, evaluate the situation, and select a course of action that reflects the person you aspire to be, rather than yielding to the immediate pressures of the moment. Without this internal governance, feelings dictate behavior. With it, feelings merely provide data. This distinction is paramount, for even as one gains psychological awareness, life does not cease to present triggers. Tension will persist, individuals will fall short of expectations, and ambiguity will remain a constant factor. Emotional discipline is the faculty that enables you to navigate this inherent unpredictability with effectiveness and poise. The foundational component of this discipline is the establishment of personal standards. If you do not predetermine your mode of conduct under duress, your emotional surges will inevitably dictate your actions. Consequently, discipline must begin well before a crisis arises, answering critical questions regarding how you intend to communicate during frustration or how you will maintain your dignity when faced with disrespect. When these standards are firmly defined, the process of decision-making is simplified. You are no longer bartering with every passing feeling but are instead measuring the impulse against a chosen identity. This practice is inextricably linked to self-regard, as upholding these standards sends a powerful internal message that your long-term evolution is far more valuable than temporary emotional comfort. Furthermore, the element of timing is essential to this practice. A vast majority of interpersonal conflicts arise not from the content of a message, but from the timing of its delivery. Feelings naturally generate a false sense of urgency, whereas discipline introduces the leverage of patience. By deliberately delaying a response, you allow the peak of intensity to subside, making room for clarity to return. Acting during a psychological peak often results in consequences that require later repair. Discipline, therefore, trains you to let the initial wave pass. This does not imply an avoidance of difficult tasks, but rather a commitment to addressing them only when you are sufficiently composed to be successful. Emotional discipline prioritizes the correct moment over the quickest one. Another vital aspect is the selection of the response itself. Discipline does not rely on a default setting of either silence or aggression. It involves selecting the most appropriate path from a spectrum of possibilities, whether that be direct confrontation, calm refusal, or intentional disengagement. This requires a high level of awareness to recognize an internal state without becoming submerged in it. Over time, these disciplined choices actually rewire your psychological system, causing emotions to lose their perceived authority as they cease to produce automatic external results. This consistency builds an unshakable trust, both within yourself and from those around you, as your composure becomes a hallmark of reliability. Finally, we must recognize the power of restraint, the understanding that not every internal thought requires an external voice, and not every feeling necessitates a deed. This is not a form of repression, but a form of discernment that asks whether an action is necessary, helpful, or aligned with one's higher purpose. Such restraint preserves your vital energy and prevents the exhaustion of unnecessary conflict. It also requires a compassionate view of one's own imperfections, viewing occasional lapses not as failures to be punished, but as feedback for further refinement. As you cultivate this discipline, the chaos of life begins to recede, and you stop bracing for internal storms because you trust your capacity to navigate them. It is the bridge that connects awareness to actual power, ensuring that you act from intention rather than mere instinct. This repeated exercise of choice is what ultimately renders your inner authority unbreakable. Within the final chapter, we examine the concept of the integrated self, which represents the culmination of unshakable inner authority. This state is not a singular achievement but the result of a unified internal system where feelings are no longer viewed as adversaries to be conquered or as masters to be obeyed. Genuine integration occurs when the various aspects of your psyche stop competing for dominance and begin to operate in alignment. Most individuals exist in a state of perpetual internal friction, where one desire pulls toward tranquility while another demands action, leading to a massive dissipation of energy. Inner power emerges only when these forces are synchronized, allowing the diverse energetic signatures of your emotions to fulfill their specific roles. Throughout this analysis, you have explored how each internal state provides unique data and vitality. Fury defines your limits, dread encourages readiness, unease highlights misplaced focus, and sorrow fosters a deeper perspective. Furthermore, detachment preserves your autonomy, while endurance and discipline provide the steadiness and agency required for effective action. Unbreakable power is the byproduct of these skills functioning in harmony. At this stage, your internal landscape no longer feels overwhelming because it has become familiar territory. You recognize the early signals, you speak the language of your impulses, and you possess the established protocols for response. This familiarity dismantles the fear of your own mind and restores your status as an internally sovereign individual, one who governs their inner world regardless of the unpredictability of external events. This level of self-governance does not suggest that life becomes effortless, but it does ensure that life remains manageable. Formidable individuals are not invulnerable to pain or loss. However, such experiences do not cause a total internal collapse because the feelings move through a stable and well-practiced structure. This structure is reinforced not through occasional insights, but through the daily repetition of awareness, restraint, and deliberate choice. Over time, these actions become second nature, manifesting not as dramatic displays of will but as a consistent reliability that both you and others can rely upon. This coherence between your thoughts, feelings, and deeds creates a profound clarity that minimizes regret and maximizes forward momentum. The resulting confidence is grounded in self-trust, the proven ability to withstand internal pressure without losing your direction. The integrated self does not fluctuate between the extremes of explosive reactivity and hollow withdrawal. Instead, it operates from a place of balanced containment. This containment is a sign of immense strength, allowing you to experience high-intensity feelings without being shattered by them. Furthermore, this stage requires a complete acceptance of your emotional spectrum, not as a form of resignation, but as a tactical partnership with your own nature. By stopping the war against yourself, you reduce internal friction and free up vast reservoirs of energy for creative and meaningful pursuits. Your internal states transition from being problems that require solving to becoming sophisticated feedback mechanisms that help you refine your path. As you conclude this journey, remember that this inner command is not a static destination, but a state that is maintained through consistent stewardship. Life will continue to provide challenges, yet integration allows for a much faster recovery and a more resilient posture. You do not require a flawless performance, only a reliable command built on deep self-understanding. The power you have been seeking has always been located within your capacity to lead yourself when the internal tides rise. Real authority comes from the ability to stay anchored when the pressure mounts, and to choose your identity regardless of your current mood. You have moved beyond the fragility of suppression into the resilience of intentionality. This quiet composure is the ultimate expression of inner strength. It is the ability to remain grounded while others are swept away. The work continues through daily practice, turning each moment of pressure into a training ground for excellence. You are no longer untrained. You are the architect of your responses, the leader of your feelings, and the possessor of an unbreakable inner power that grows stronger with every conscious choice you make.